if I ask you to prove that you have a spine, I mean, you could just pull up an X-ray.
Right, exactly, or an MRI.
Yeah, the doctor just points to that jagged white line on a glowing screen, and the debate is over.
It's physical, it's binary.
Right, and it's deeply comforting to our modern data-obsessed minds. But if I ask you to prove why you feel a sudden, crushing sense of guilt after lying to someone you love.
Oh, the X-ray machine is completely useless there.
Totally useless. I mean, you cannot put human morality under an MRI.
No, you really can't.
So welcome to Reformed Thinking, a deep dive into the architecture of the human soul. Today, we're opening up Charles Hodge's systematic theology.
A massive work.
Yeah, truly massive. And we're tackling a question that has, honestly, broken the minds of philosophers for centuries.
Which is, where does the idea of God actually come from?
Exactly. Like,
Wow.
Are human beings biologically and psychologically hardwired to believe in a creator?
Or do we figure it out, like a really complex math problem?
Right. Or is the divine just, I don't know, the oldest surviving myth passed down around a campfire?
It really is the ultimate question of human origin and, well, epistemology.
Yeah.
Because when we leave the realm of the purely material, like the bones and the tissue you mentioned.
The X-ray stuff.
Right, the X-ray stuff. When we leave that and enter the realm of the mind, the conscience, the spirit, the tools of measurement have to change entirely. We are entering some very muddy diagnostic waters.
We really are. And whether you are, a lifelong student of theology or just someone who is fearfully curious about how human beings process the concept of the divine.
This specific text is going to be amazing for you. It offers a literal masterclass in psychological and spiritual anatomy.
It really does. So for you, the listener, as we navigate this philosophical landscape today, I want you to turn your attention inward.
Yeah, think about your own mind.
Exactly. Think about how you come to know the things you confidently claim to be true. Because to understand where the idea of God comes from, we first have to understand the operating system of human knowledge itself.
Right. And according to Hodge, historically, there have been 3 primary answers to this origin question.
Okay, let's lay them out. The first is that the knowledge of God is innate.
Meaning it is hardwired right into our very constitution.
Right. And the second?
The second historical answer is that it's a deduction of reason.
Meaning we look at the world, do the math, and figure it out.
Exactly. This is the perspective that says we observe the complexity of the universe, we map out cause and effect, and we logically deduce that a grand designer must exist.
Right. And then there's the third answer.
Yeah, the third claims this knowledge is the result of a supernatural revelation that is preserved entirely by tradition.
So in that view, God spoke to the earliest humans, and that specific knowledge has just been handed down through the generations.
Like a historical game of telephone, from civilization to civilization.
Okay, so innate, deduction, or tradition. And Hodge vigorously defends that first option, right? The idea that the knowledge of God is innate.
He defends it very fiercely, yes.
But, I mean, before we can even begin to examine the evidence for that, we really have to define our terms here. Because innate it's a highly radioactive word in philosophy.
Oh, absolutely. It gets misunderstood constantly.
Right. When the average person hears innate knowledge of God, their mind immediately goes to, like, a newborn baby.
Lying in a crib.
Yeah, lying in a crib, staring at a ceiling fan, and consciously contemplating the existence of a supreme, infinite being.
Which is frankly absurd.
Totally absurd.
It's completely absurd, and if we allow that flawed definition to stand, Hodge's entire argument collapses before it even begins.
So how does he define it?
Well, Hodge is incredibly precise here. He explains that innate knowledge is not knowledge founded on external experience.
So?
It is not obtained by external instruction, and it's not acquired by a process of scientific or philosophical research.
So it's not something you go out and find.
Right. Crucially, it does not mean a child is born with active, conscious theological convictions just floating around in their head.
Because knowledge, in the active sense, requires consciousness.
Exactly. A newborn does not have a conscious conviction of the existence of God.
Okay, that distinction right there
Yeah.
between active and passive knowledge,
Yeah.
that is where the real mechanics of his argument live.
It's the core of it, yeah.
I want to lean into that for a second. How can a human being know something passively? Because if it's not in your active consciousness, in what meaningful sense do you possess that knowledge?
Well, consider the vast library of historical or practical facts you've accumulated over your lifetime.
Okay.
For instance, what is the capital of France?
Ours?
Right. Now, 10 minutes ago, were you actively contemplating the city of Paris?
Definitely not. No,
Was it occupying your conscious thought?
not at all.
Yet you still possessed the knowledge.
Right.
That data was just lying dormant in your mind. It existed completely out of the domain of your active consciousness until the precise moment I asked the question.
And your question was the occasion that roused it.
Exactly. Hodge points out that the vast majority of our knowledge actually exists in this dormant state. Innate knowledge shares this dormant quality, but with a massive distinction.
Which is what?
You didn't learn it from a textbook. It is stored in the very constitution of the soul as we come into the world, just waiting to be roused by the appropriate occasion.
Okay, let's ground this in a modern analogy, because that helps me visualize it. It sounds like innate knowledge isn't a pre-written Word document that is already open on your computer screen the moment you unbox it.
Right, it's not a file.
It is the operating system itself. The hardware comes pre-installed with an architecture.
I love that analogy, yes.
Like the computer doesn't have to learn how to read a USB drive when you plug it in. The fundamental coding required to understand and process the data on that USB drive is already there. It's running in the background, waiting for the input.
That captures Hodge's point perfectly. The operating system doesn't generate the external data itself, but it possesses the innate structural capacity to recognize it, process it, and accept it as real the moment it is introduced.
The capacity is born with the machine.
Exactly. And this is exactly where Hodge draws a massive battle line against philosophers like John Locke.
Oh, right. Locke and the tabula rasa.
Yes. Locke famously popularized the idea that the human mind is a completely blank slate. He rejected innate ideas because he assumed theologians were claiming the mind was born with, quote, patterns, phantasms, or notions.
So Locke thought the claim was that we're born with a mental dictionary already filled with definitions.
Right. Which takes us right back to the ridiculous image of the baby in the crib contemplating a theological dictionary.
Yeah, and Locke's rejection makes intuitive sense if that is the definition of innate. I mean, if I'm born a completely blank slate, that every single thing I believe about God, morality, or reality, it has to be written onto my slate by society or my parents or my own empirical observations.
And Hodge actually agrees with Locke on that specific narrow point.
He does.
Yeah. We aren't born with fully formed abstract principles floating in our conscious minds. But Hodge clarifies that innate knowledge simply means the mind is so constituted, the operating system is built in such a specific way, that it perceives certain things to be undeniably true without ever needing mathematical proof.
Or an external teacher.
Right. The mind is built to recognize the truth of certain realities immediately, in their own light, the moment they are encountered.
Wow. Okay, but if we accept that premise, it raises a massive epistemological hurdle.
How so?
Well, if the human mind is pre-wired this way, what else is pre-wired? Because if I am listening to this as a strict empiricist, I am immediately throwing up red flags.
Sure.
Before we take a leap into something as universally controversial as the existence of God being an innate intuition, we have to prove that this kind of intuition even exists in human beings at all.
That's a fair demand.
Right. Is there anything else in the human experience that functions this way?
Well, Hodge anticipates that exact skepticism.
Yep.
He argues that this intuitive capacity isn't some special, isolated mechanism reserved only for theology.
Yeah.
It is the bedrock of all human experience. He actually breaks down intuitive truth into three distinct everyday departments:
Which are?
the senses, the intellect, and the moral nature. If we look closely at these three areas, we realize that we rely on innate intuition constantly. Denying its existence in theology requires you to deny its existence in your everyday life, which just leads to total absurdity.
Okay, let's put those three departments under the microscope then, starting with the physical senses.
Let's do it.
Because claiming our senses are intuitive truths feels risky. Our senses deceive us constantly.
They certainly can.
Right. Optical illusions exist. People hallucinate. If I see a mirage in the desert and I think it's an oasis, my senses literally lied to me.
Okay.
So how can Hodge claim sensory input is an innate, infallible intuition?
He actually accounts for the misinterpretation. Hodge notes that we frequently draw erroneous conclusions from our sensations. The intuition does not guarantee that your deduction about the sensation is correct.
Okay, wait. I need you to break that down further. Where is the line between the sensation and the deduction?
Let's use the sensation of physical pain.
Okay.
Say you feel a sudden, sharp pain in your leg. You might misdiagnose the cause entirely. You might conclude you pulled a hamstring when in reality it's referred pain from a pinched nerve in your lower spine.
So my intellectual conclusion about the source of the pain is completely wrong.
Yes, exactly. But you know intuitively, without needing a neurologist to prove it to you with a chart, that the pain itself is real. You are experiencing it.
Okay, so going back to my mirage in the desert, I mistakenly deduced that the shimmering light was water. My conclusion was false.
Right.
But I cannot possibly be mistaken about the fact that I am seeing something that looks like shimmering light.
Precisely.
My intuition that I am experiencing the phenomenon of sight is absolute and undeniable.
You apprehend the object of your sense immediately. The conviction that attends our sensations is due entirely to the constitution of our nature, not to instruction.
So no one had to sit you down as a toddler and teach you the philosophical justification for trusting your nerve endings when you touch a hot stove.
No, the operating system just knows it.
Okay, that covers the material world. Our physical senses validate our physical experiences. But what about the second department, the intellect?
Right. So there's a whole category of truths which the intellect perceives to be true immediately without requiring external proof or historical testimony.
Like what?
Well, Hodge points to the foundational axioms of geometry as the clearest example. You do not need a multi-page mathematical proof to understand that a part of a thing is less than the whole of that thing. You simply perceive it.
Like the classic pizza analogy.
Exactly.
If I have a whole pizza and I remove one slice, that single slice is definitely smaller than the remaining pizza. I don't need a double-blind, peer-reviewed study to verify that. It is self-evident to the human intellect.
Or the axiom that a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. But Hodge actually takes it much deeper than geometry. He brings up the fundamental concept of cause and effect.
Cause and effect is an innate intuition.
Yes, it is an intuitive, intellectual truth that nothing cannot be a cause. Every effect must have an adequate cause.
I'm going to challenge that, actually. Don't we learn cause and effect purely through experience?
How do you mean?
Like a toddler knocks over a tower of wooden blocks and they fall. The toddler observes the cause and the effect. It's an empirical learning process. It's not an innate intuition.
The toddler observes the specific instance, yes. But Hodge argues that human experience is, by definition, finite and limited. We have not observed every single event in the history of the universe.
Sure.
Yet, our intellectual conviction isn't just that every effect we have personally witnessed has had a cause. Our conviction is that in the very nature of reality, there absolutely cannot be an effect without a cause.
So the toddler learns that hitting the blocks makes them fall, but the underlying intellectual framework,
The assumption that something must have caused this change, is part of the mental architecture they are born with. Without that innate framework, the falling blocks would just be meaningless, disconnected visual data.
man, that brings up a fascinating friction point, though.
What's that?
If these intellectual axioms are self-evident, if they're just built into the human operating system, why do we see such a massive variance in intellectual capability?
Oh, that's a great question.
Right. Because I know brilliant people who can look at a complex logic puzzle and instantly see the solution, and I know people who legitimately struggle with basic fractions. If this is innate, shouldn't every human being possess the exact same intellectual clarity?
That is a crucial nuance, and Hodge addresses it beautifully. He argues that while the presence of the intuition is universal, the capacity or the power of that intuitive perception varies wildly from person to person.
So what dictates the capacity?
Think back to the physical senses. The senses of some people are far more acute than others. A person who is completely blind often develops an incredibly heightened, exquisite sense of hearing or touch. The capacity of their innate sensory intuition in those areas is exalted.
Right.
Hodge argues it is the exact same dynamic with the intellect. What requires pages and pages of laborious step-by-step proof for one person to grasp is seen instantaneously as a self-evident truth by another person with a more powerful intellect.
The text mentions Sir Isaac Newton as an example of this, right?
Yes, it is a famous historical anecdote. When Newton first read the first book of Euclid's geometry, he found it almost entirely redundant.
Really? Wow.
Redundant.
Yeah. He didn't need to work through the complex propositions and proofs. He looked at the advanced theorems and found them just as self-evidently true as the basic axioms. His intuitive intellectual vision was operating at a wattage that most humans can't even fathom.
So the intuition is present in both the struggling math student and Sir Isaac Newton, but the processor speed is just radically different.
Okay, so physical senses validate the material world, and the intellect validates logic and mathematics. But neither of those explain the human guilt complex or the drive for justice.
Right, the moral element.
Yeah, human beings are purely logical meat machines. Where does morality come from? There has to be a moral architecture alongside the physical and intellectual.
And that brings Hodge to the third department, the moral nature. Just as there are physical and intellectual intuitions, there are moral truths which the mind intuitively recognizes as true. For example, the essential distinction between right and wrong, the inherent obligation of virtue, the unshakable reality that we are responsible for our character and our conduct, and that moral wrongdoing inherently deserves punishment.
But wait, modern anthropology would push back hard here.
Oh, definitely.
Critics of this view constantly point out that different cultures have radically different definitions of what constitutes right and wrong. If morality is an innate intuition, why does one culture view certain actions as virtuous, while another culture views those exact same actions as horrific?
That is the classic argument for moral relativism. But it confuses the application of the law with the existence of the law.
How so?
We may fiercely disagree on what specific actions constitute an injustice, but the underlying category, the undeniable reality that there is a profound difference between right and wrong, and that we are obligated to do what is right, is innate.
I see.
No human society exists without a concept of justice, even if their specific laws differ from ours. No one seeks further evidence that these moral categories exist. The evidence is found in their very nature.
And just like the intellect, I assume this moral intuition can be varied.
Yes. The more a person's moral nature is purified and exalted, the clearer their moral vision becomes, and the wider the scope of their moral intuitions.
To synthesize where we are for the listener, we have established that human beings possess an operating system preloaded with intuitions.
Right.
We have sensory intuitions, intellectual intuitions, and moral intuitions. But how do we cross the philosophical bridge from I intuitively know a straight line is the shortest distance to I intuitively know God exists?
That's the big leap.
Right. How does Hodge prove that God belongs in this highly protected category of innate truths?
To cross that bridge, Hodge establishes the rigorous criteria for proving any truth is an innate intuition. If we are going to claim something is a foundational axiom, a law of belief that renders all other faith and knowledge possible, it must meet two strict, non-negotiable criteria.
And what are those?
Universality and necessity. What all humans believe and what all humans must believe.
Okay, I want to stop and put a massive spotlight on a caveat from the text regarding universality, because it is incredibly easy to misunderstand.
It really is.
Universality only applies to truths that are founded in the constitution of our nature. It does not apply to universal observations about the external world.
That is a critical distinction to make.
Because think about human history. There's a long period where it was universally believed that the sun moved around the earth.
Right, geocentrism.
Yeah, geocentrism was a universal human consensus. But that didn't make geocentrism an innate truth. That was just universal ignorance based on a limited perspective of the external material world.
Exactly. When ancient people watched the sun rise and set, they were observing something external and drawing a logical, albeit flawed, conclusion. That is entirely different from a truth that originates from within the human constitution, like the internal sense of moral responsibility.
Right.
So when Hodge asks if the existence of God is an intuitive truth, he's asking if the belief in his existence is universal and necessary in a way that springs spontaneously from our internal nature, not just from observing the weather or the stars.
That clarifies the criteria. But before we look at the evidence for this universality, we have another major definition problem.
Oh, the definition of God.
Yes. When Hodge boldly claims the knowledge of God is universal, what kind of God is he actually talking about? Because if he is arguing that every human being is born intuitively knowing the intricacies of Trinitarian theology or the specific doctrines of a 17th century confession of faith, that is an impossible position to defend.
Hodge completely agrees, and he is very careful to define his terms here. He acknowledges that the word God is used in a very wide sense.
Right.
If you take the full, robust Christian definition, that God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, unchangeable in his being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth, Hodge states plainly that no human mind ever attained that sublime, detailed idea intuitively.
That level of specific, robust theology requires supernatural revelation, It requires external instruction and the reading of Scripture.
Exactly.
So for you, the listener, we are not arguing that every person walking the earth secretly possesses a theology degree that they're just hiding.
Right. And on the far other end of the spectrum, some modern philosophers use the word God to just mean a vague motion, a cosmic force, or some abstract idea of the infinite.
Let me guess. Hodge rejects that too.
He rejects that watered-down definition as well. He is arguing for a very specific structural baseline.
How does he define that baseline?
The baseline intuition is a general sense of a being on whom we are dependent and to whom we are responsible. It is the internal conviction that we are not the highest, ultimate authority in the universe.
It is the inescapable feeling of looking up and knowing you answer to something higher.
Yes. Hodge argues that if you rigorously analyze this baseline idea, it inherently embraces the conviction that this being is a person, possesses moral attributes, and acts as a moral governor over human affairs.
The intuition of ultimate accountability.
Yes. He isn't claiming that uneducated or uncivilized societies have mapped out the complex philosophy of a moral governor. He is simply maintaining that this profound, inescapable sense of dependence and accountability to a higher being exists in the mental architecture of all humans.
Okay, let's look at the actual proofs for this universality. How does Hodge attempt to prove that this baseline intuition is present in every human being?
He brings in two main areas of evidence: Scripture and history.
Since we are doing a deep dive on Reformed thinking, let's start with Scripture, specifically the letters of the Apostle Paul.
Which form the bedrock of this theology. Hodge points directly to the book of Romans, chapters 1 and 2. He notes that the biblical text consistently asserts that the knowledge of God is universal, both through direct statements and profound implication.
Right.
Paul writes concerning the heathen, meaning those who did not possess the written Jewish law or the scriptures, that they knew God, but deliberately chose not to glorify him as God. Paul asserts that even the most depraved societies understand the righteous judgment of God.
What I find so philosophically fascinating about this biblical argument is the structural observation. I mean, the Bible rarely, if ever, stops to offer a philosophical proof that God exists before it starts issuing moral commands.
That is a brilliant observation of the text's architecture. The scripture everywhere addresses human beings as sinners, calls them to repent, threatens punishment, or promises pardon, all without pausing to provide a preliminary cosmological demonstration of the being of God.
It completely assumes the audience already knows.
It assumes the operating system is running. It takes for granted that all men, by virtue of their humanity, know they are subject to a moral government.
But a skeptic reading the Bible will immediately point out that Scripture also talks about people being without God in the world.
It does. But Hodge argues from the exegetical context that being without God does not mean these individuals have a literal blank space in their mind where the concept of a higher power should be.
What does it mean then?
It means they are without a correct, saving knowledge of God. They are alienated from his favor. They are living in rebellion against the moral governor, not in pure ignorance of the category of the divine.
And this ties directly into Paul's argument in Romans 2 about the law being written on the heart. Paul says that people who don't have a written code of laws still do, by nature, the things the law requires because their conscience bears witness.
Exactly. The conscience is the internal courtroom. When your conscience condemns you for an action, it is actively pronouncing that you violated a moral law. And when it approves of you, it pronounces you conform to that law.
That makes sense.
Hodge's profound point is that the recognition of God, a being to whom we are ultimately responsible, is entirely wrapped up in the very idea of having a conscience. Every single time you feel moral guilt, you are carrying in the constitution of your being the empirical evidence of a moral lawgiver.
And since the sense of sin, guilt, and responsibility is universally human, the knowledge of the God who enforces that responsibility must be universal as well.
That's the argument, yes.
Okay, so that is the theological and scriptural argument. What about the historical and anthropological argument?
The historical argument is sweeping. History demonstrates that the religious element of human nature is just as universally present as our rational or social elements.
Okay.
Wherever human beings exist, in all ages, in all parts of the world, under every conceivable climate and government, they develop some form of religion. The idea of God is permanently impressed on every single human language.
And language is the ultimate psychological artifact. It is the roadmap of what is happening inside the human mind. If every isolated culture independently invents a word for a higher power, it means the concept is bubbling up from within their internal architecture, completely independent of their geography or external instruction.
Right. As Hodge argues, since language is the direct product and revelation of human consciousness, the universal presence of a name for God proves beyond a doubt that the idea belongs to the constitution of every human being.
I have to play the skeptic here because this is where the debate gets really sharp. If we are making massive, sweeping claims about all humans in all ages, my immediate reaction is to hunt for the outliers. If it's truly universal, what about the exceptions? What about people or societies who seem to have absolutely no concept of God whatsoever?
And that is exactly where the historical pushback came from in Hodge's era. He addresses two major specific objections to this idea of universality.
What's the first one?
The first objection comes from the reports of 18th and 19th century European travelers and missionaries. They claim to have discovered remote, degraded tribes that had absolutely no idea of God, no religious rites, and no concept of the divine.
So you have these explorers going into uncharted territories, coming back to the scientific academies of Europe and saying, we found them. We found the purely blank slates, people with a complete void regarding religion. It's incredibly convenient to just say the explorers missed it. How does Hodge rigorously counter that?
He dismantles it on two fronts, the philosophical principle and the practical reality of anthropological observation.
Okay, let's hear the philosophical principle.
Philosophically, he uses a very sharp, almost brutal analogy. He says, suppose you did discover a remote tribe of people who were completely devoid of reason, a tribe of idiots, to use the blunt language of 19th century academia. Would the discovery of that tribe prove that reason is not an innate attribute of human nature?
No, it would just prove you found a tragic anomaly, a devastating exception to the rule, perhaps due to some extreme environmental isolation or genetic catastrophe.
Yeah.
It doesn't rewrite the definition of the human species.
Exactly. Or suppose you discovered a localized community where infanticide was universally practiced without a shred of remorse. Would that prove that parental love and the instinct to protect offspring is not a fundamental human instinct?
Obviously not.
Right. It would prove that the instinct had been horrifyingly suppressed, broken, or demoralized in that specific, highly abnormal context. So his philosophical point is that even if a tribe with zero concept of God existed, it wouldn't overthrow the established rule of human nature any more than a tribe without reason would.
That makes perfect logical sense. But does he actually concede that these religionless tribes exist?
No, he deeply doubts the accuracy of the reports themselves. This is his practical counterargument, and it exposes the massive arrogance of European explorers.
Arrogance how?
He points out how incredibly difficult, if not impossible, it is for foreign travelers to truly penetrate and understand the deep interior spiritual lives of cultures that are vastly different from their own, especially when navigating massive linguistic and cultural barriers.
Oh, I can completely see that. If a 19th century European explorer, whose mind is filled with a highly developed cathedral-building systematic theology concept of God, goes to a remote tribe and starts asking translated questions, they are looking for a reflection of their own highly exalted concept.
Precisely. And when they don't find European academic theology being discussed around the fire, they arrogantly and foolishly conclude these people have no concept of God. But Hodge says, as long as these people show they have a functioning conscience, a sense of right and wrong, and as long as they show consciousness of responsibility for their conduct to something outside themselves, the idea of God is undeniably present. The seed of the moral governor is there, even if the European explorer is too culturally blind to recognize it.
That handles the explorer objection beautifully. What is the second objection to universality?
The second objection comes from the documented cases of deaf and mute individuals, again, using the medical terminology of his era, who completely isolated from language and external communication prior to being taught sign language, sometimes reported later in life that the idea of God had never once entered their minds.
I have to stop you there because that sounds like an incredibly convenient, almost unfalsifiable defense for Hodge.
How do you mean?
Well, if a person literally says, using their newfound language, I had no concept of God until you taught me, and Hodge's response is, well, your intuition was just too vague for you to realize it was God, isn't Hodge just retreating? If there is zero empirical proof of their intuition until they are explicitly taught Christian theology, Locke's blank slate theory seems much more scientifically sound here. How does Hodge survive this objection?
It is the strongest objection, I'll admit, but Hodge survives it by analyzing the massive psychological shift that occurs during their education. He argues that we have to look at the transition from pre-linguistic isolation to articulated theology.
Okay.
When these individuals finally receive instruction and are given language, the knowledge they gain is so vastly superior, so bright, clear, and articulated that their previous pre-linguistic intuition seems like absolute nothingness in retrospect.
So it's a matter of contrast.
Exactly. And sudden living your entire life navigating a dark room by the faint, almost imperceptible glow of a single firefly. Then someone flips on a stadium floodlight.
Oh, I see.
If someone asks you later what it was like before the floodlight, you would say, "It was pitch black, I couldn't see anything." You'd dismiss the firefly because the floodlight is so overwhelming.
That's a great analogy.
Hodge argues that it is conceptually impossible for a human soul to exist in any state of development without a sense of moral responsibility. They felt guilt. They felt the weight of right and wrong. And responsibility, by its very definition, is felt toward an invisible being higher than self. They lack the vocabulary to name the moral governor, but they absolutely felt the weight of his governance.
Okay, I think we have rigorously defended the universality criterion. But I want to pivot to the second, much harder criterion. Universality is one thing, but what about necessity?
Necessity is tricky, yes.
Because we said earlier that an innate truth must be universally believed, but also necessarily believed. What do we do with the undeniable fact that atheists exist right now? They're walking around writing best-selling books, hosting podcasts, and loudly proclaiming they do not believe in God. If belief is a human necessity, how can atheism exist?
This is the crux of the entire philosophical debate. Can a sane, rational person disbelieve in God? If necessity is the absolute criterion for innate truth, atheism shouldn't be biologically or psychologically possible.
Right. No one walks around writing books passionately denying that 2 + 2 = 4. Yet, as you pointed out, atheists abound in every age. How does Hodge reconcile this contradiction?
He does it by establishing that not all necessary truths have the exact same kind of grip on the human mind. He actually outlines 3 distinct categories of necessity.
Let's unpack those 3 categories because this is where the psychology gets deep.
The first category is the unthinkable. These are truths where the exact opposite has absolutely no meaning to the human brain.
Give me an example.
For example, saying that a part of a thing is greater than the whole, or saying that an effect happened without any cause. If a man stands up and says something is nothing, he isn't expressing a counter-argument. He's literally speaking nonsense. His words have no cognitive value. You cannot even think the opposite of these truths.
Right. My brain cannot compute something is nothing. It just throws an intellectual error code.
Exactly. The second category involves physical truths regarding external or material things. These truths have a massive power to constrain belief, but it's a different kind of power than the unthinkable.
Okay, so physical truths, like what?
For example, a man cannot rationally deny that he has a physical body, or that he has a will, or that the world around him exists. The impossibility of denying these is equal to the first category, but it affects the mind differently because it relates to material existence.
Okay, so if the idea of God isn't in the unthinkable category and it isn't in the physical category, what is the third type?
The third type are truths of our nature, and this is the critical distinction. These are truths that can actually be denied.
They can be.
Yes. However, they can only be denied by doing profound violence to the laws of our own human nature. The denial is forced, it requires immense effort, and it can only be temporary. The laws of our nature are guaranteed, sooner or later, to assert themselves and constrain an opposite belief.
This is where Hodge introduces an analogy that I think is one of the most brilliant pieces of philosophical imagery in the text, the analogy of the pendulum.
It is a masterful, devastating illustration. Picture a heavy metal pendulum hanging at rest. By the fundamental laws of physics and gravity, it naturally hangs straight down, perfectly perpendicular to the horizon. That is its natural, unbothered state.
Okay, I have the picture.
Now, you can apply an extraneous external force to it. You can grab the pendulum with your hand, pull it back to a steep 45-degree angle, and hold it there.
And as long as you are actively gripping it and expending energy, it stays at that unnatural angle.
Right. You are defying gravity through the application of force. But the very millisecond you remove that external force, what happens? It doesn't float there. It immediately and violently swings back to its normal, natural position at the center.
Wow. So applying this to the psychology of atheism.
Hodge argues that a person can use false philosophy, intense speculative reasoning, or even just the blinding, numbing effect of persistent vice as an external force to pull their mind away from its natural belief in God.
So they can aggressively suppress the intuition.
Yes. And their disbelief might be entirely sincere. They might hold that mental pendulum back for decades and genuinely convince themselves that the 45-degree angle is its natural state, but it requires constant, active, metaphysical heavy lifting. It is a state of unnatural tension.
That completely reframes the entire conversation. So the argument isn't that atheists are maliciously lying to themselves or secretly harboring a belief they refuse to admit. It's that their current state of mind is in a state of unnatural, exhausting tension. They're holding the pendulum back against the gravity of their own moral nature.
Precisely. And Hodge points out that this forced insensibility, this metaphysical flexing, cannot last forever. When the external speculative force is removed, the belief snaps back.
And what removes that speculative force?
A sudden crisis, imminent danger, profound suffering, the approach of death. Whatever suddenly rises the moral nature and strips away the luxury of abstract philosophical speculation. In those moments of raw human vulnerability, the grip on the pendulum slips, and the belief in God often snaps back instantaneously.
You hear cultural echoes of this all the time. The old military adage, there are no atheists in foxholes.
Exactly.
Which isn't perfectly true in every single instance, of course. But it speaks to this exact, undeniable psychological phenomena. When the artillery shells start falling, the complex philosophical arguments against a moral governor suddenly vanish, the grip slips, and the innate intuition takes over.
Hodge observes that men pass from entrenched skepticism to desperate faith in these moments instantaneously. Not by a process of logical argument. They don't suddenly solve a complex philosophical riddle while facing a firing squad or a terminal diagnosis. They simply experience a state of consciousness with which skepticism is completely irreconcilable.
And it's not just the uneducated who experience this, right?
No, not at all. He notes this happens to men of the highest academic culture and intellect. When the artificial force is removed, the pendulum swings to the center for the philosopher just as fast as it does for the peasant.
So Hodge's ultimate conclusion on the necessity of belief is this. The moral law written upon the human heart is indelible. You cannot erase it, no matter how hard you scrub.
And because a moral law intrinsically implies a moral lawgiver, someone who possesses the authority to enforce that law, as long as humans remain moral creatures, they will and must ultimately believe in a being to whom they are responsible.
It's like you can plunge your hand into ice water until it loses the sense of touch. But that numbness doesn't prove the hand isn't naturally the organ of touch. You can numb your soul with speculative philosophy, but the moral nature remains, waiting to thaw.
That's a great way to put it.
So, to summarize the journey so far, Hodge has painstakingly argued that the idea of God is an innate intuition. It is universal across the human species, and it is a psychological necessity, even if it can be temporarily suppressed by force. But if this belief is so deeply ingrained in our operating system, why do so many brilliant thinkers argue for the second option? Why do people argue that we aren't born with it, but rather we just use our advanced brains to deduce it from observing the physical universe?
That brings us directly to Section 6, why the deduction theory falls short.
Right, the deduction of reason. This is the idea that God is just the ultimate logical scientific generalization. We look at the world, we see breathtaking, intricate design, the complexity of the human eye, the balance of ecosystems, the precise mathematical orbits of planets, and we logically assume a master designer.
Exactly. We see effects all around us, and we deduce a first cause. It feels incredibly logical and satisfying.
It is logical. And to be abundantly clear, Hodge is not saying those scientific and philosophical arguments are bad, false, or useless.
Not at all.
But he argues fiercely that they cannot account for the origin of the idea of God in the human mind.
Right.
Why not? If they are logical, why can't they be the origin point?
Because such complex, sweeping scientific generalizations are only possible for highly cultivated, highly educated minds. If the only way human beings came to believe in God was by observing astronomical phenomena, studying biological design, and deducing a first cause through formal logic, then the vast majority of the uneducated masses throughout the entirety of human history would never have possessed this deep-seated belief. But they do. The historical record shows they do.
That's a devastating historical point. A 12th century peasant wasn't studying the cellular complexity of the optic nerve to conclude that God exists. Yet their belief was often far stronger, more resilient, and more foundational than the highly educated philosophers of their era.
Furthermore, Hodge appeals directly to our own internal consciousness. We do not reason ourselves into believing God exists as a primary foundational step. When we deeply introspect, our own consciousness tells us that's not how our faith actually operates. It doesn't begin as a sterile academic syllogism.
But wait, I have to push back here because my own experience feels contradictory to that.
Oh.
Think about standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon or looking at a brilliant sunset over the ocean or looking up at a canopy of stars on a pitch-black night. You feel this overwhelming, visceral sense of awe. And the thought that there must be a creator who painted this feels so natural and primary. It feels exactly like I am deducing his existence directly from the majesty of nature. Why is Hodge dismissing that profound human experience?
He isn't dismissing the reality of that experience at all. He is clarifying its function. Hodge explains that observing the majesty of nature, seeing design, and feeling awe does not originate the foundational belief in a higher power. It confirms, develops, and expands it.
Oh, I see.
The deduction process is how the pre-existing intuition is expanded and its real contents are unfolded to the conscious mind.
Ah, so the intuition is the concrete foundation already poured in the ground, and looking at the sunset is building the beautiful house on top of it.
Exactly. Very little is given by raw intuition in any field. A primary intuition is just the seed. What is discovered in that seed needs to be expanded by observation. If this is true of our intellect, where we start with basic self-evident axioms and then use deduction to build complex fields of geometry and calculus, why shouldn't it be true of our religious nature?
It totally should be.
We start with the innate sense of accountability, the baseline operating system. Then we look at the sunset, and our mind uses deduction to say, the moral governor I already know I am accountable to is also incredibly powerful and creates breathtaking beauty. Deduction adds the attributes. Intuition provides the subject.
That makes perfect sense of the psychology. And Hodge takes this a step further with a really profound philosophical argument about human faculties. He argues that faculties intrinsically imply their objects.
This is perhaps one of his most compelling and unique arguments. Every single faculty and feeling of our minds and bodies has an appropriate corresponding object in reality, and the very possession of the faculty inherently supposes that the object actually exists to satisfy it.
Let's explore the physical examples first. The eye implies light.
Yes, the human eye, in its very biological and cellular structure, is intricately designed to receive and process photons. It supposes, by its very existence, that such an element as light actually exists in the universe. If the universe was entirely, permanently devoid of light, the biological development and existence of the eye would be utterly unaccountable, useless, and inconceivable.
The ear implies sound.
Exactly. The complex mechanism of the inner ear, the sense of hearing, would be an absurd biological joke if vibrations in the air didn't exist to interact with it. The sense of physical touch would be inconceivable if there were no tangible material objects in reality to interact with.
And he applies this exact same logic to our psychological, social, and spiritual faculties.
He does. And the implications are massive. Our social affections, our innate, driving desire for friendship, love, and community necessitate the assumption that there are other conscious beings and relations suited to those exercises. Our moral nature, our deep sense of justice, equity, and right and wrong supposes that moral distinctions aren't just imaginary chimeras, but reflect a real moral order.
So if we take that relentless logic and apply it to theology.
In like manner, consider our deep-seated religious feelings, our innate sense of absolute dependence, our inescapable consciousness of moral responsibility, our profound, unquenchable aspirations for fellowship with some buffer, being higher than ourselves, higher than anything this physical, decaying world can offer. All of these built-in universal human faculties necessitate the belief that a God exists to fulfill them. If the physical sensation of hunger implies the existence of food, then the soul's profound hunger for the divine absolutely implies the existence of God.
That is a staggering thought because it completely inverts the most common skeptical argument. The modern skeptic says, you just invented the idea of God to satisfy your psychological needs. It's a coping mechanism for your fear of death. And Hodge is essentially looking them in the eye and saying, no, the very fact that the human species universally possesses those specific psychological and spiritual needs in our constitution is the biological and philosophical proof that the object of those needs exists.
Exactly. It takes the skeptic's weapon and turns it back on them. Now, there is a theological objection that arises here, which you hinted at in the outline regarding the concept of virtue.
Right. Some philosophers and even well-meaning theologians object to this whole idea of innate belief by saying, if belief in God is forced upon us by our intuition, if it's just built into our operating system and we can't help it, then there is no moral virtue in believing. It's just a biological reflex, like blinking or breathing. And if there's no virtue in it, it can't be considered true saving faith.
Hodge handles this by making a razor-sharp distinction between the origin of a feeling and the nature of a feeling. He argues that the moral character of our feelings depends entirely on their inherent nature, not on how they originated.
Give me a tangible example of that distinction.
He uses the example of a mother's love. A mother's love for her newborn child is deeply, undeniably instinctive. It springs directly from the constitution of her nature, heavily influenced by biology, hormones, and innate evolutionary psychology.
It's hardwired. She doesn't have to read a book to learn how to love the baby.
It is entirely hardwired. Yet, do we ever look at a mother caring for her child and say, there is no moral virtue in her love because it's just a biological reflex? Of course not. We universally praise maternal love as beautiful, noble, and highly virtuous. And conversely, the absolute absence of maternal affection in a mother is seen as something horribly unnatural, monstrous, and the object of universal societal condemnation.
The sense of pity for the weak, the feeling of justice when someone is wronged, the desire to help someone who is suffering. These are instinctive, hardwired reflexes for most healthy people, but we still recognize them as deeply virtuous traits.
Exactly. So the exact same logic applies to our religious feelings and the belief they involve. We cannot help feeling that we are responsible to a higher power, and it is objectively right and virtuous that we should feel so. The man who violently forces himself into a state of absolute insensibility to all moral obligation isn't achieving a state of pure, unbiased, enlightened logic. He is becoming what the scriptures call a reprobate. He is actively demoralizing and degrading his own being.
So, to use the biblical framework that Hodge is operating in, Adam in the Garden of Eden believed in God the very moment he was created. But he didn't believe because he sat down and did a cosmological logic puzzle. He believed in God for the exact same reason he believed in the trees and the animals standing in front of him. His unclouded, uncorrupted religious nature apprehended God with the exact same immediate confidence that his physical senses apprehended the physical world.
That is Hodge's ultimate theological point here. Human beings are bound by their very nature to believe in God, and they cannot emancipate themselves from that foundational belief without derationalizing and destroying their whole being.
Okay, I think we have thoroughly dismantled the idea that scientific deduction is the origin of our belief. It's a confirmation, but not the source. But what about the third theory? We mentioned it at the very beginning of the deep dive. What about the people who say everything we know about God is just a hand-me-down story? The tradition theory.
This is a view held by some very earnest conservative theologians. They are unable to believe that the knowledge of God can be referred to human nature or to reason, because they believe human nature is too corrupted. They look at the highly exalted, pure view of God in the Bible, and they look at the various corrupted, polytheistic views of God in different global cultures, and they conclude it all must trace back to one single, original, supernatural revelation.
Like God speaking directly to Adam and then later revealing himself to Abraham and giving them the pure, unadulterated truth.
Yes. The tradition theory claims that from those specific historical origin points, the knowledge of God passed to their descendants. And basically, all knowledge of God in the entire world is just radiation from the Jewish people and that primal revelation. The further away you get geographically and chronologically from that historical source, the more degraded and corrupted the knowledge becomes. The closer you are to the source, the purer it is.
It's literally a historical game of telephone. The message starts crystal clear in Genesis, but as it gets passed down through millennia and across continents, it gets garbled into various myths, legends, and polytheistic religions.
Exactly. Now, Hodge's take on this is remarkably nuanced. He doesn't just throw the tradition theory in the trash. He deeply respects this view because it stems from a profound reverence for the written word of God. And he actually concedes several major points to the tradition advocates.
What does he concede to them?
He agrees that as a historical reality, the further back we go in history, approaching the time of the primal revelation, we often find purer forms of monotheistic knowledge. He also agrees, as a general rule, that populations brought under the direct influence of the truth held by the chosen people of God became vastly more enlightened. Furthermore, he strongly agrees with the biblical assessment that when human beings, left entirely to their own speculations, reject supernatural revelation, they turn the truth of God into a lie, as the Apostle Paul says, and lose the saving knowledge of the true God.
Okay, so if he agrees with so much of their premise, why does he call this view extreme and ultimately reject it as the origin?
Because it attempts to make historical tradition the exclusive source of the idea of God. And in doing so, it completely ignores the internal law written on the human heart.
Ah, I see the flaw. If it was only tradition, then a culture entirely cut off from the origin point, say, a civilization on an isolated island in the Pacific that never once interacted with the descendants of Abraham or heard the primal revelation, would be a complete moral and religious blank slate. They wouldn't even have the garbled telephone message. They would have absolute silence.
Exactly. And as we discussed extensively earlier, anthropological history shows that isn't the case. Every isolated culture still possesses a functioning conscience, a deep sense of moral obligation, and some concept of a higher power to whom they answer. Tradition and supernatural revelation are absolutely essential for giving us a pure, saving, robust knowledge of who God specifically is, but they are not the origin of the basic intuitive category of the divine.
To use another analogy, the innate intuition is the canvas. Tradition and supernatural revelation are the paint. The paint provides all the intricate detail, the vibrant color, the specific saving image of who God is. But if you don't have the pre-existing canvas of innate human intuition to apply the paint to, the revelation has nowhere to land. It wouldn't stick. The human mind wouldn't have the architecture to receive it.
That is a perfect synthesis of Hodge's position. Our intuitive perceptions absolutely need to be cherished, developed, and interpreted by supernatural revelation, but the intuition must be there first as the landing pad.
Okay, this brings the entire conversation home to the modern skeptic. We've journeyed through this dense, fascinating philosophical and theological landscape. We've established we have this innate intuition that is universal to the species, that it is a psychological necessity, that it isn't just a math equation we solved, and it isn't just a historical rumor. But here's the final, incredibly practical question. If all this is true, can we actually prove God exists to someone who sits across from us at a coffee shop and demands hard evidence?
This is the proof problem, and it is the final, vital question Hodge tackles in this section of the text. Can the existence of God actually be proved through argument? Now, surprisingly, a large class of highly influential theologians and transcendental philosophers, people like Immanuel Kant or Samuel Taylor Coleridge, emphatically say no.
Wait, really? Famous theologians and philosophers say you cannot prove God exists. Why would they concede that ground?
They argue this based on the very premise we've been discussing for the last hour, intuition. They say that because the knowledge of God is fundamentally intuitive, it is not a proper subject of mathematical or logical proof. They build their argument on a sharp distinction between two different faculties of the human mind, the reason and the understanding.
How do Kant and Coleridge define those two faculties?
They argue that the reason is the higher intuitional faculty. It apprehends eternal necessary truths by immediate direct vision. It just sees them. The understanding, on the other hand, is the lower discursive faculty. It's the part of the brain that observes data, argues, categorizes, and forms logical conclusions. They argue that God belongs entirely to the exalted province of the reason, not the mechanical province of the understanding.
Okay, I think I see where they're going. They're saying you cannot use the mechanical tools of the understanding to prove something that lives entirely in the intuitive realm of the reason.
Exactly, and they use compelling analogies to make their point. They say, you cannot use logic to prove to a blind man that an object is red. You cannot use a mathematical equation to prove to someone that a piece of Mozart's music is beautiful or that an act of self-sacrifice is good. Goodness and beauty are subjective qualities you just have to intuitively perceive. Since you can't prove beauty with a syllogism, you can't prove God with one either. Even some theistic writers argue that the good need no proof that God exists, and the wicked are entirely unsusceptible to conviction anyway, so proof is useless.
I have to say, that sounds incredibly profound on the surface, but it also feels incredibly elitist. It's basically saying, if your higher reason doesn't immediately see it, and I can't explain it to your lower understanding, you just don't have the spiritual wattage. It essentially ends all evangelism and apologetics. How does Hodge respond to Kant and Coleridge?
Hodge identifies a massive, fatal flaw in their logic. He calls their argument a fallacy of categorization, and his counterargument is crucial for anyone trying to defend their faith. He points out that beauty and goodness are subjective qualities that must be discerned by the mind, but the existence of God is an objective fact.
Oh, that is a massive difference.
It changes the entire playing field. God is not just a subjective quality of the universe, like the beauty of a painting. God is an entity, an objective reality, a being. And even though our baseline belief in that reality is intuitive, it is perfectly legitimate to show that there are other external objective facts that necessarily lead to the exact same conclusion.
Just because I intuitively know I have a physical body doesn't mean I can't also use an X-ray machine to objectively prove to someone else that I have thumbs. The presence of the intuition doesn't invalidate the usefulness of external proof.
Precisely. We can look at the objective facts of the universe and show that they rationally demand the existence of the God our intuition already senses.
But wait, if that's true, why do so many classical philosophical arguments for God seem to fall short in modern debates? A skeptic will listen to the cosmological argument, point out one potential flaw or alternate theory, and say, see, your proof is invalid, therefore God doesn't exist.
Hodge addresses this frustration directly. He says that most of the objections to theistic arguments arise from a massive misapprehension on both sides of what those arguments are actually intended to prove.
What do you mean? What is the misapprehension?
People expect one single silver bullet philosophical argument to prove the entirety of the Christian God. They want a single syllogism that spits out an infinite, eternal, personal, moral creator who loves them. But Hodge says that's not how the arguments are designed to work. It is a team effort. One argument proves one specific element of the doctrine, and other arguments prove different elements. You have to put them together.
So, break down the team for me. How do these arguments stack?
Let's look at the three classic arguments Hodge leans on. First, the cosmological argument. This is the argument from cause and effect, that the universe is an effect and must have a first cause. This argument is incredibly strong, but it is only intended to prove the existence of a necessary and eternal being.
Right. It proves there is an uncaused foundation to reality. But it doesn't prove that this first cause is smart or that it cares about us.
Exactly. And that's usually where critics attack it. They say the first cause could just be a mindless eternal energy. But Hodge says that's fine. The cosmological argument only intended to prove the eternal necessity. To go further, you bring in the second player on the team. The teleological argument. This is the argument from design. We look at the mind-bending complexity of biological life, the fine-tuning of the cosmological constants, the structure of DNA.
The classic watchmaker analogy. If you find a watch in the woods, you know there was a watchmaker.
Yes. The teleological argument builds on the foundation of the cosmological one by proving that this necessary eternal being is profoundly intelligent. The intricate design proves a conscious designer.
Okay, so now we have an eternal, highly intelligent being. But an alien supercomputer could be eternal and intelligent. That still isn't the God of the Bible.
Which is exactly why we need the third and perhaps most crucial player, the moral argument. We look at the universal human conscience, our innate sense of right and wrong, and our inescapable feeling of moral accountability that we spent this entire time discussing. This argument proves that this eternal, intelligent being is a person possessing moral attributes.
Wow. Let me summarize this, because this is an incredibly powerful apologetic framework. The philosophical arguments aren't trying to invent a God out of thin air to convince a skeptic. They are simply demonstrating that the being our intuition already tells us is there actually possesses all the specific objective attributes that theism claims. The cosmological argument gives us his eternality. The teleological argument gives us his intelligence. The moral argument gives us his personal moral nature.
Exactly. They work perfectly in tandem to validate the internal intuition. The arguments demonstrate that the being who reveals himself to man in the very constitution of human nature must logically, objectively, be exactly who he claims to be.
It's like putting a massive puzzle together. The innate intuition gives you the picture on the box, so you know what you're trying to build and what the final image looks like. And the philosophical arguments are the individual pieces snapping together to form the objective reality of that picture.
That is a beautiful way to express it, and that is why Hodge maintains that despite the reality of intuition, the existence of God is absolutely a proper subject of rational proof. We don't have to choose between our deep internal sense of the divine and our rigorous logical intellect. They are two witnesses testifying to the exact same reality.
Well, this has been an incredible mind-expanding journey. For you, the listener, I want to briefly recap the massive terrain we've covered today on this deep dive. We've explored the deepest, most foundational architectures of the human mind. We've seen how the knowledge of God isn't just a learned behavior that you passively picked up in Sunday school. It isn't just a cold, scientific deduction you make after looking through a telescope at the stars. And it certainly isn't just an inherited myth from ancient ancestors playing telephone.
It is the baseline operating system of the human soul. It is universal, meaning every single human being possesses it by virtue of their humanity. It is necessary, meaning you have to actively, exhaustingly fight your own nature to suppress it. And it is logically sound, supported by the very empirical evidence of the universe.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something for you to explore on your own, building on one of the most profound things Hodge pointed out today. We talk extensively about how our human faculties inherently imply their corresponding objects. The physical eye implies the existence of light. The ear implies the existence of sound. Our deep sense of right and wrong implies the existence of a moral lawgiver.
Right.
If all of that is true, what about the other deep, unshakable hungers of your soul? Think about your own personal, relentless desire for a life of deep, internal significance. That haunting feeling that you were made for something vastly more than just waking up, working, paying bills, and eventually returning to dust. If you are physically hungry, it means food exists in the universe to satisfy that physical hunger. So, if you find yourself searching for ultimate eternal meaning, what does that imply actually exists waiting for you beyond the veil of this physical universe? You can't put that spiritual hunger under an X-ray machine, but the symptom points to an undeniable, objective reality.
Amen to that.
Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation on reform thinking. Remember, the pursuit of truth isn't just something you do. It is written right into your very nature. We'll catch you next time.